Hello, everyone, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Naomi Dorner, and this is the first Nelson Nygaard webinar. And today's topic is on equitable public engagement practices during COVID and beyond. So before we get started, I just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping. For questions that you have, you can submit those in the, I believe there's a Q&A. If you submit those through the Q&A, we will get to as many as we can. We'll try to kind of elevate similar questions during the Q&A. And with that, we'll get started. So again, my name is Naomi Dorner, and I am the Principal and the Director of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at Nelson and Nygaard. At Nelson and, well, the panel today, I'll talk about our panel and then Nelson Nygaard, but our panel today includes wonderful community advocates, as well as one of our partners at the Natural Resource Defense Council, and one of our very own staff members. Cameron Steinbeck is with Livable Communities, and sorry, he is with FutureWise. Excuse me. Cameron Steinbeck is the Livable Communities Coordinator at FutureWise, where he is responsible for coordinating and leading community engagement programs. Cameron is also a graduate student working towards his Master's of Education at Antioch University, Seattle, and his studies focus on an urban environmental education and a legacy project to develop racial equity tools for FutureWise's community-based work. He's also an educator with experience leading K-12 classrooms and youth volunteer programs in his home region of San Francisco Bay Area. So he's from the Bay. His communication experience includes formal learning programs focused on solutions to address climate change at the individual and community levels. Through it all, he holds a passion for advancing environmental justice through community action and participation in urban planning. So thank you for joining us, Cameron. We also have Zach Acquardi. Zach is a transportation advisor at the National Resource Defense Council, working with 6 cities to advance transportation policies and projects that advance city climate change goals as part of the American Cities Climate Challenge. Previously, has consulted on transportation policy and climate change mitigation for a variety of nonprofit NGOs and for nonprofit organizations, and worked as a senior research associate at Transit Center, where he co-authored several national policy reports, including 2018's Inclusive Transit. And we also have with us today Yanisa Techegumthorn. Yanisa is an associate transportation planner at Nelson Nygaard. She believes in a people-first mobility and ensuring that the shift to a more multimodal world is inclusive in all communities. She brings skills in research, GIS, and data storytelling, as well as knowledge about historical impacts of the 20th century transportation change on marginalized groups. Before Nelson Nygaard, Yanisa worked on transportation policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation Volpe Center, as well as research projects at MIT related to implementing transit-oriented development and assessing the impacts of highway and transit changes on Boston's low-income neighborhoods. And Yanisa is in Boston, and I am based in Oakland. And with that, I would like to do a little bit of an introduction to Nelson Nygaard. Nelson Nygaard is a transportation and planning firm, a consulting firm, and we put people first. We have a variety of sectors that we work through, and I won't read through all of them, but we work in a number of cities across the U.S. Our reach is international, and we work with a number of cities. What we do is sorry, I'm looking to make my screen a little bigger. There we go. Transportation is how we change the world, from mitigating climate change to improving public health and dismantling historical inequities. And we also partner with clients and communities by using data-driven tools to help them align their transportation investments with their values. We also work together to achieve broader goals of equity, community, economic development and healthy living with communities. And finally, first and foremost, and also finally, we start by putting people first. So in terms of today's conversation, and we'll just jump right into it, but basically there was a lot of conversation internally at the firm as the reality of COVID and the impacts that it was having in communities, specifically Black and Brown communities and with essential workers, as it related to transportation and mobility. And a number of our partners and clients were wanting to understand what kinds of tools and what kinds of support and thought leadership we could offer or provide with regards to how to engage in this moment, specifically communities that are impacted, and specifically communities that we're still moving around and that will still be moving around as a result of their functions in the economy as essential workers. And we had a variety of tools, and we have assessed a variety of tools, but what we thought was really important was that we also took a step back to assess how we were doing engagement, how engagement had been done, but also what this moment requires, and equity being at the core of the work that we do here at Nelson Nygaard, and at the core of what was needed and is needed in communities, especially now as it relates to transportation. We wanted to put together a framework for thinking through how to approach equitable engagement, public engagement, as well as outreach in this moment. And so we feel that taking a step back while also assessing tools and using criteria from an equitable engagement framework was really the best way to pivot and to provide resources and information and thought leadership to our partners and colleagues. So with that, I want to turn it over to Yanisa, who was really the co-author in the principles, and she will walk us through what those principles are.
Thanks, Naomi. So as Naomi was saying, we decided to take a step back and look at the principles behind tools rather than the tools themselves as a first step, since oftentimes tools and methods for public engagement are chosen and then adapted to attempt to fit the needs of different communities and projects. And we wanted principles that people can proactively consider that center social and racial equity before the tools are picked. And with that, we came up with 10 principles for equitable public engagement, which I've grouped into 4 buckets that I'll go through just right after this. And we designed these principles for transportation and urban planning practitioners. And we want them as a start to a conversation and definitely not the end all be all. Cool. So the first subsection of the principles that we have is identifying goals and communities impacted. So before projects even begin, it's important to know the purpose of the projects as well as the purpose of going through the public engagement process in the first place. Which means it's important to be clear and transparent about how the input gathered through these processes will affect decision making. And doing an equitable public engagement process means that project budgets should definitely allocate enough resources to fully conduct an equitable process and have resources for stuff like staff time, stipends for focus groups or community ambassadors, digital and analog tools for facilitators, translators, and ADA accommodations. And then once we have the goals and purposes, next we should identify who the most vulnerable communities are that the project will potentially impact. So knowing which communities you're trying to reach, especially historically marginalized ones, can really help identify organizations that can help provide insight on how to reach these marginalized groups and what tools will be the most appropriate. So part 2 is once we have these communities considered, we should be designing methods to target them. So once these vulnerable communities are identified, and we design outreach and engagement methods that center them, we recommend creating equity criteria to help narrow down and refine the tools. And these criteria can include things like community penetration, which is the level of traction and reach that the tools will have, accessibility, which includes ADA, but also includes language translations and cultural relevancy. And then also user friendliness and legibility. So how universal are these tools without having to explain them, especially having to explain them in English. And then by assessing these tools on like these 3 criteria or more, and seeing what works well for vulnerable communities, we likely are able to capture things that work well for other communities as well. So once we have a draft of the methods, we should consider paying representative organizations and community leaders to provide input and test these tools. These leaders know best about how to reach their communities, so partnering with them to ensure that you're designing outreach and engagement in a way that works to fit them. And their time is valuable, so it's important to pay them. And then as you conduct the public engagement itself, it's important to weigh and prioritize input and criteria provided by vulnerable communities. Because even after going through this entire equitable public engagement process, there's a pretty high chance that the voices of marginalized groups like people of color and low-income communities will still be underrepresented, and the type of people that typically show up to a public meeting will still be overrepresented. So it's important to weigh the input coming in to make sure that the underrepresented views are as influential, if not more, than the overrepresented ones in public engagement. Cool, so part 3 is about, these principles are about designing and applying the methods themselves. And so even in COVID times, it's really important to remember that analog tools can be just as innovative and effective as digital tools. And you can see through what political, social, mutual aid organizers have long relied on in the past for engagement, especially to reach vulnerable communities. So consider things like phone banking, mailing paid flyers and mailers maybe attached to utility bills, or like distributing signage and posters to human services providers so that frontline workers can share the information with communities they are serving. Video and phone conferences for focus groups and meetings definitely have a place. And then always pushing ADA and language accessible information about engagement opportunities in all aspects of the engagement process. Now, there's definitely not a one-size-fits-all approach for any of the projects that we may be doing, and definitely digital tools can be used to augment existing analog ones. But it's important to assess the barriers that come with each tool, and it's also important to use a mix of tools to be able to reach different groups in different ways. However, whatever mix of tools you use, it's also important to be consistent with your messaging in that sharing the same information and providing the same context really helps gather the information that can be weighted and prioritized across different sources and different communities. And then also being creative is fun, and also there's a lot of ways you can do public engagement. And consulting with local community groups and leaders, especially youth and artists, can really help create culturally relevant ideas that have traction and penetration to communities. And then for our last 2 principles, these are for evaluating and following up after engagement. So regardless of the engagement tool, it's crucial to build trust by being responsive to questions, providing timely responses, and following up after the process has been completed. And people really do like to know that their input was valuable and trusted. So, and trust as well as distrust can last long after a project is over. So you can think of these partnerships as the beginning of a community relationship. And then lastly, acknowledge, document, and forgive mistakes. So engagement is really difficult, especially now during a pandemic, but being transparent about mistakes and learning from them and documenting them, they really help propel us forward and evolve our understanding of equity. And it will help us in the future work down the pipeline. It also opens up room for constructive feedback from the communities that we're working for so that we can continue to serve them right. Great, so Yeah, so these were the equitable engagement principles, and now I'm going to turn it back to Naomi to introduce the panelists.
Thank you so much, Anissa, for walking us through the principles. Again, these are published, and we will send a link as well as forward that link along with the presentation to participants after this. So with that, I would love to turn it over now to Cameron, who again is working at FutureWise, which is an organization, a statewide organization in Washington. And you know, Cameron, can you please tell us a little more about your organization and some of the work you're doing and ways in which you've applied some of the principles we just heard about and pivoting your engagement efforts?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm going to make sure you're hearing me all right. Actually, yeah, there we go. So yeah, once again, I'm Cameron Steinbach, the Livable Communities Coordinator for FutureWise. So I'll introduce FutureWise a little bit and then go into some of the project work that I'm doing and some of those examples of how we're switching things up and changing and adapting during this COVID-19 shutdown. FutureWise as an organization works throughout Washington State to support land use policies that encourage healthy, equitable, and really opportunity-rich communities. We deploy a lot of different tactics in moving that forward. The department that I work in specifically, Livable Communities, focuses on that part of the mission that takes a look at the urban environments and communities, really stewarding and encouraging that equitable, livable, and resilient community focus of our work. It's often really project-based. We have a lot of partner-centered actions, and also a system approach as well. So hopefully some of the questions will talk about the system that we're seeing and how we can organize the community to advocate for the best adjustments for those. Now, the projects we work on ranges a whole bunch of things, from mobilizing community support for inclusionary zoning policy to planning a suite of green stormwater infrastructure projects here in the western side of the state. But when I came into FutureWise back in October as part of my graduate program practicum, it was really focused on community engagement with a public participation grant down in Algona, Washington. Now, I've been the program lead since January, but FutureWise has been involved in Algona for several years. And it started with a groundwater contamination from a nearby airplane parts manufacturing facility. And that response is, the response to that is governed by the Model Toxics Control Act and the Department of Ecology and the potentially liable party. Now, the initial communication with the community around the discovery and the extent of the contamination, of course, caused a lot of concern for folks' health, for their communities, their homes, and the healthy environment as well. And unfortunately, there was trust between those agencies didn't get off to a good start. And that's where FutureWise was brought in to really act as a community advocate and community partner to ensure that their needs, their questions were going to be organized and channeled in a positive and proactive way so that their voice could be accurately represented in this process, which can take years, and there may be months between opportunities for the public to participate in. So through our relationship building, through educational activities, community stewardship, we're able to build that trust with the community as a partner to make sure their voice is represented in this process. Now, my work in getting started in this was really going door to door in the community to survey residents, to find out their level of understanding of the issue, to see what resources that they wanted or needed, but also to really collect their thoughts and feelings, and in a lot of cases frustration at the process itself. So there's a lot of education about the process, and then relaying that to the agencies that are responsible for conducting large parts of it. Now, my learning about this community was going door to door, talking to people face to face, working with our community partners, whether they worked in parts of the civic government, the city of Algona, or smaller, just going to people's homes and communities. And that's where some of the equity issues that we started to notice There were folks in the community who had been there for years, their entire lives, and they had a lot of detailed information about the project and what was going on, and they had their own feelings about it, and what was done well, what wasn't. We also found that there was people who were new to the community, and I was the first person to let them know that this contamination had taken place. So there's already some issues that we knew we had to address from the get-go, and our plan was to have a suite of community meetings in addition to our going door to door with the information about the contamination and how people can inform themselves, how we can support them, and getting their comments, getting their voice in the process, and continue that engagement with them and with the community. Now, with the COVID-19 shutdown, that face-to-face interaction was suddenly and abruptly out of the picture. So, of course, as the principal, as an organization, we have a lens. We want to really be accountable to the equity principles that were laid out for this panel. So it's really checking out what are our resources. Our resources are, of course, our expertise in organizing the community and talking with the community and having those relationships, and communicating with the different agency and civic partners. Now, since we can't do that work face to face, we really had to look at, like, what is our digital profile? How are people able to access things on our website? But also, how are people able to continue accessing our printed materials? And that's where those relationships in the community are really important. Now, on the digital front, been recording some videos that we're going to be sharing with our community partner who works in the city community center, that give a platform for people to engage with us in a way that, since we can't be there, they can connect with us immediately and easily. Now, the equity principles involved in that, we of course don't know how many people have access to broadband internet or the visit in that website. So one, developing that resource, but making sure it's equitable and accessible to as many people in the community as possible. We know that there is a large Spanish-speaking community and multiple language community there in Algona. So as we're producing these videos, we're ensuring that we're putting in language captions in there as well. Or when we're sharing something like a link to our website or the Department of Ecology website, they're making sure that those links are also connecting to translation services. Or we're proactively getting those activated, translating them, and then it's accessible in those languages right there as well. But recognizing there is a digital divide from people of different abilities and people to different access to broadband internet. As Denise said, there's those analog principles that are really, really important. So developing our flyers, which we initially going door to door, putting them at their doorstep or handing them to folks directly, getting those posted in different parts of the community so people can see them, access them, and continue to distribute them amongst themselves. So our approach is really to develop a web of opportunities for the community to still feel like they have that partner in us, that they can get resources, that they can express their concerns and questions, and we can make sure that we're holding our partners at the state level, at the private entity level, to make sure that those principles are upheld, so that all the other partners who are coming into the community when feasibility studies are going to be taking place, that those things are in place and we can do those things. Now, another part that I've been really excited about is how we're doing these things, how we're reaching communities through education. We've had a long tradition in Algona of having different community stewardship actions. And I was able to continue that this spring, even through the COVID outbreak, with the relationship we had with a elementary school teacher. Now, this is focused a bit more specifically on some of our wetland stewardship we're also doing in the area. But I found this as a platform that we can continue to get some community penetration through educational activities, specifically doing a recording of a groundwater model that is geared for elementary age children, but in that I'm using language that asks them to investigate things around their homes, with their siblings, with their parents. So it's a great educational tool that encourages participation with the community that people are already in right there. And then that's kind of something that we want to look forward to and continue to build that out over the summer, even as schools close, that the community recognizes they have this partner in the digital fashion, but also available in these analog fashion through phone calling, through email, through flyers in the community, that they have access to, and that we're going to be an active partner throughout the time. Now, with that, there's also, a degree of humility. There's more pressing matters that people are experiencing from, different kinds of health and economic stresses. So making sure that we're presenting ourselves as available and accessible. We have to stay within the limitations of our grant program itself, but recognizing where our community partners are doing different kinds of work, wearing different hats, and that we can still be accessible to support all of their actions and endeavors. So I'll pause right there. Maybe we can get to some different questions as some of our other panelists, and I can talk to some of those other examples of how we're hearing from the community, what they're sharing with us, and how we're adjusting some of those outreach and plan going forward.
Thank you, Cameron, for sharing, just sort of the breadth of strategies that you're exploring and beginning to implement. And also that, you're as an organization and as a community partner, being understanding and empathetic of like where communities and what their stresses are at the moment. I think that's something that we do need to reflect on. But at the same time, keeping with what your focus is and the project goals and what the campaign is, keeping that moving as best you can, and just being really sort of transparent with like the circumstances and what they are at the moment. So I think it's really great. We'll get to questions in the Q&A, definitely have some coming in. But first, I'm going to go to Zach. Zach at Natural Resources Defense Council. And Zach, if you could do the same thing, paint a picture for us of the organization, of course our work, I know you'll do that together, as well as work that you're currently doing and ways that you see engagement pivoting in this moment around equitable principles.
Great. Thank you, Naomi and Yanisa and Nelson Nygaard for doing this work and creating a space for this conversation, as well as for including me. It's really a pleasure to be part of this, and I'm glad to be able to learn from all of you and hear what our audience is interested in here. On NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council. We are an environmental nonprofit. This is our 50th anniversary year. We work to safeguard the earth. We have about 3 million members worldwide, more than 700 staff internationally, and we use policy, scientific, and legal expertise to protect people's right to air, water, and the wild. My role at NRDC is as part of a project called the American Cities Climate Challenge. The Climate Challenge was launched by Bloomberg Philanthropies with NRDC as one of the lead partners as a 2-year effort that started last year to work in partnership with 25 cities across the US and work with those cities to go further, faster in implementing their climate action plans in the domains of buildings, renewable energy, and transportation. So my work focuses on transportation. I work closely with 6 of our 25 cities, and I also coordinate our national work with Nelson Nygaard. Our transportation work through the Climate Challenge cuts across many different domains. We work on transportation demand management, we work on biking and walking projects, we work on public transit, and Nelson Nygaard is one of more than a dozen national partner organizations that works with us specifically on transit, biking, walking, TDM and parking, as well as congestion pricing work. And that work cuts across more than 20 of the 25 cities that we work with. So it's really a pleasure to get to work directly with them and to leverage Naomi and the whole firm's expertise on a variety of things. So I want to talk a little bit about the way that that this current moment is challenging our work, and then provide a couple of those concrete examples, primarily from my specific portfolio of cities, but I can also maybe in the Q&A touch on work that's happening in the rest of the portfolio as well. So the coronavirus is causing, first and foremost concerns about worker and public safety, challenging household budgets as well as city budgets, introducing just huge uncertainty. In some of our work, it's impacting some of the legislative and policy development processes. I think that's the least of a lot of people's concerns, but it is something that that we care about. And then of course it's wrapped up in all of those things, really disrupting public engagement processes and challenging, I think, a lot of cities as well as us to reflect on ways that we can kind of meet this moment. And I think is really important, and I want to pause here just because I think that this is a really critical kind of make or break moment for building trust in the communities that we work with. People really remember how you treat them and how you talk to them in their most vulnerable moments. And for a lot of people, this is a really deeply vulnerable moment. People who are out of work, people who are sick or who have close family members or friends who are sick or have died, and so it's always really important to be building trust, but this is a moment where people are really going to remember how cities, how our organizations worked with them and met them in this really challenging time. And I think that it's also, I think, an important moment to reflect on, I think, a legacy of a legacy of inequitable community engagement practices. The kind of traditional model of town hall meetings it has been, I think, broken for a long time. And I think starting with the humility to recognize that kind of traditional pathways of community engagement have not been working, have particularly not been working for our most vulnerable communities and otherwise. Having the humility to acknowledge those past shortcomings is critical to committing to do better and then making it so. Basically, this need to reflect on how we can do better was already urgent, and now this is an opportunity to really meet that need and start thinking creatively. So I'll start with a couple of examples that speak to kind of parts 1 and 2 of Nelson Nygaard's principles, focused on identifying the kind of most important communities, the people kind of with the most urgent needs, and then designing processes and policies to meet those needs and to meet people kind of where they're at. And I think that one thing that we see in our work is that not only is incorporating these principles of equitable engagement into our projects the right thing to do, but it's also the strategic thing to do. It builds trust and cultivates support for projects, both in the short and long terms. And when you design a program or a process for your most vulnerable users, you're also designing that better for everyone. And this is going to better meet kind of city goals as well as community goals. So a couple concrete examples. One is one that I'm really excited about is that I get to work with the city of Chicago, and the city of Chicago is partnering through the climate challenge with a kind of emerging coalition of transportation advocates who are really deeply committed to transportation equity. And so with some grant funding distributed through the climate challenge, we're funding these organizations to play a direct role in a new strategic planning process that the Chicago Department of Transportation is undertaking. So basically, the Chicago DOT leadership has identified, these are critical stakeholders, not just in our transportation policy world, but specifically in setting the direction, setting the vision for this agency in a really critical time. And I think that recognition that these community-based organizations and nonprofits in Chicago really offer critical expertise that the agency itself doesn't have is really crucial to recognizing that it's valuable to give financial resources and to give time and to give more of a platform and a voice to directly inform the strategic plan of the agency is a huge opportunity for the city of Chicago, obviously also a huge opportunity for these groups, and something that we're really proud to be supporting and to be playing a small role in. Another example that I have really loved is I also work with the Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul. And in St. Paul, the city has been working to develop a new electric mobility hub program that will include a subsidized electric car sharing program. So as part of the design process, so this is in the very early stages, they're just thinking about what will this program look like, what will the mobility hubs themselves look like, what will the pricing structure and the business model look like in their partnership with Our Car, which is their local car sharing provider. And they really prioritized, okay, if we want this to be a program that really works for low-income residents and for residents of color in St. Paul, we need to make sure that those communities are at the table as part of this design process. So what they did is they worked with, the city worked with Our Car and with a couple of other climate challenge partners to create these focus groups. So they brought in local folks, paid them for their time to participate in these focus groups, and then brought some kind of initial ideas to them, what this program might look like, what it might take for them to use it, what are some of their existing barriers, not just to using car sharing, but just to accessing the things that they care about accessing. And then to kind of go through the exercise of thinking about how this potential program might help them meet their needs more or not. And so including those folks early on in this kind of, in the core design process itself, really make sure that those needs are going to be met. What it also does, which I think is really powerful, is it creates an opportunity to come back to these specific members of the community and to say, hey, we had this conversation. Do you want to stay involved? Would you like to come back and see another iteration of our design process? Or is there, would you potentially be interested in kind of being an ambassador for this program as we flesh it out over time, which I think also starts to touch on part 4 of Nelson Nygaard's principles, which is about building trust by following up. And so with that, I'll go into kind of my last kind of group of examples, and which are focused on being creative. And I think that the opportunity to really reevaluate some of our digital engagement tools, think creatively about how to use them, but also how to pair those with some of the analog tools that Nelson Nygaard's called out. I think our cities are a good case study in kind of the breadth of what's possible. So a couple specific examples. VIA, the transit agency in San Antonio, has been holding these town halls over that are held over telephone, and they've been able to engage more than 2,000 people at a time using this technology that it has near universal access in our community. And think about the difference in scale between kind of a traditional town hall, even though a phone conference isn't going to give you like that really deep, really meaningful engagement. Just the ability to give 2,000 people the chance to hear what the agency is working on, and also have the opportunity to add questions that then can get answered in front of that considerable audience is pretty amazing, and something that I think a lot of cities, a lot of transit agencies haven't been using proactively as part of the toolbox, and that creates an opportunity to really scale engagement. I loved an example as well from the city of Denver, using an online platform that allows folks to express opinions and also to share some kind of information about themselves. So, this was in the context of a climate planning effort where you'd be able to say, I'm part of this advisory council, or I'm not part of it, I'm part of the business community, or I'm not. You could imagine filtering by a lot of other things, but then you can see along a spectrum, how strongly do you support this statement that our plan should be focused on delivering services to the most vulnerable communities. And you can see along the spectrum who supports that, which kind of stakeholder groups they might represent, and really make clear to any member of the public who's looking at this input, who's weighing in, what kind of different perspectives are represented, and how do those perspectives vary among these different and really important stakeholder groups. And then one other kind of fun one is in Charlotte, where the city's working on a comprehensive plan. In this process, they've recognized that one of the stakeholder groups whose voice has really been missing in the earlier phases of the process is young people. And so, as part of seeking to boost youth engagement, their assistant city manager, who's in charge of both the planning department, oversees both the planning department and a lot of the city's transportation work, has spearheaded a TikTok campaign where they're making videos, trying to go viral, and whether or not it works at scale, whether or not they succeed in getting a billion views on TikTok, it's really being creative. It's meeting this moment by being willing to try something new, to take a chance, to try to target the specific stakeholder group who they view as really critical and whose voice has been missing so far. So let me just close there and say, we can see these good examples across a lot of projects in our work. I'm sure in each of your cities and in each of your organizations, you'll have more examples where things have worked well. And I think that there's still really few projects where cities, transit agencies, nonprofits have been successful across the board in applying all these principles. And again, for me, that's just an exercise in humility and recognizing how much work we have to do as a community, as individuals, as organizations, in making sure to think thoughtfully about these principles. So thank you again to Nelson Nygaard for compiling this and creating this space.
Thank you, Zach. Really appreciate those really substantive examples of different cities and ways in which the principles are, centered in some of those strategies. And related to, some of the last examples, and Cameron, some of the work that you're doing, there's a number of questions. So I'm actually going to start pivoting to questions from the audience because we do have a number, and I would like to get through as many as possible. I think that you did a really good job of illustrating both how to identify the community members that have and are experiencing some of the most disproportionate outcomes as it relates to this moment, but also, historically, and ways in which the engagement is being done strategically. Can you, and you started to speak to this a little bit, Zach, but there are a number of questions that are really related to the reality of constrained budgets in this time. And, there's obviously great interest on behalf of agencies and DOTs and cities to do this work, but they're facing some really stark realities as it relates to resourcing. And so wondering if you could speak to ways in which within the budgets that you either have and or that cities have, or limited resources that they now have, how creatively and what the resourcing looks like at this stage? Because we did say it's important. So what are ways in which that is being accomplished in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I can start by saying, I think, like, big picture, we're having to do a lot of this kind of prioritization in our work, and it creates a lot of really hard conversations. One thing, the push that I'd make and the challenge that I'd give, particularly to folks in city government, is that if you're thinking about cutting, like, if you're looking at a trade-off between cutting project budgets and cutting public engagement budgets, really challenge you to reflect on how much long-term damage you can do to trust in your communities, and long-term damage you can do to your project pipeline by cutting that public engagement budget. And in cases where you have to make those hard choices, I think it's really important to fight for those public engagement resources, because that trust building in this particular moment is so critical. And it's going to be tempting to say, we can't do public engagement the way that we've been used to, and so we can scale that back because we just can't do it. And I think that impulse has the potential to really do long-term damage to trust in communities that will threaten cities' ability to deliver projects in the long run. So I'll say that as kind of a general principle. And there are a couple of ways that I think that cities can be creative. A couple of leading examples, and I'm thinking about Metro Transit's development of the Green Line project in the Twin Cities, which is now an example from many years ago, but a prominent one, where a lot of the engagement that the agency did with communities was supported by local philanthropies, and so that could be one opportunity to try to identify some new funding to say, this is a really critical time. We'd like to go deeper. We'd like to test some new methods, and that's a message that can resonate with local funders.
Great, thank you so much. Cameron, do you have anything to add, and examples or resources, ways that you're resourcing at your organization?
In terms of, like, specifically allocating resources to different community partners, it's something that we look at in our planning process when we're taking a good look at a community and how we are looking to reach certain goals for the engagement goals, whether it's just organizing, whether it's stewardship, whether it's getting to a public comment. Who's going to be best able to do that work in that community? It might be us in those situations. We like to lead that, but since our work is really partner focused, and it really goes into, as a nonprofit, is how we plan out our work in that. So if we're applying for a specific grant, we're looking for, is that grant have an item where certain parts of that budget or certain parts of the money that's allocated to us, we can then allocate to identified community partners who are going to be more capable of doing certain parts of work, such as folks who are going to be, or a community organization that might be more adept at translating for a very specific section of that community. So that's one of the ones we look at in our planning. Can we make sure that we have that? And that goes with our internal accountability principles that we're looking to make sure that that kind of compensation is available if it's needed.
Yeah, and I'll just add, and Eunice, I don't know if you have anything to add. I think that the landscape and the very constrained financial realities that we know cities and agencies are facing make this a particularly difficult moment for a variety of reasons. But I really want to underscore Zach's point that the decisions that are being made as it relates to who and where and how services and goods are delivered, and like the way that we treat people. I mean, I think that was a really key point, will be remembered, and that definitely is about trust. That's definitely about community building, and in this moment, not perpetrating or continuing to perpetrate harms is a very real, and I know that it's something that, you know, agencies and cities are aware of and not wanting to do. And I think that the investment, I guess is the best way to put it, the investment that can be made, and it may not be what it potentially would have been, but the investment that can be made and the intentionality behind the investment is and will be remembered. And it is also what you can build upon as recovery does take hold, and it will take hold. We know this from cycles. This is not like something we faced before, but it is something that we can be more resilient to by making the kinds of investments that we can now, and the intentionality to really persevere on you know, the front of not only making right, but making whole communities that have for a very long time not been. And so I guess I just wanted to underscore that. I think that there are a number of philanthropic organizations and partners that are funding and looking to support specifically communities, not necessarily budgets for cities, but looking to partner to create and co-create you know, equitable visions for the future that communities are considered and are strong partners in. And I think that in order to, like, I think a strong evaluation point of how and where to invest from the perspective of philanthropic organizations is what is already invested from the city side in making these futures reality and realities a part of decision making and outcomes in the future. So on that note, I do want to pivot to another question. Oh, sorry, Yanisa, did you have anything you wanted to add on this one?
Yeah, there was just one thing I wanted to add in that a lot of times, like given when we're kind of returned to our offices and after the run of the pandemic is over, even if project budgets are still constrained, it might be time to kind of evaluate what types of public engagements that we do want to put our limited resources to. So like a lot of times projects budget for like typical town halls and public meetings, and those actually have a lot of hidden costs behind them in terms of staff time and other resources that could be directed into a different type of engagement that would better target vulnerable communities.
Great. Another really important question that has come up that I'd love to get folks' take on is, and the question is from Adamas, and it is, use this time to move away from strategies for community penetration to shifting power to communities that has been displaced or marginalized through transportation planning and policy. I think this is related to the trust building conversation and again, the making the investment. And so just wondering from the perspectives of our illustrative panelists, what your thoughts are on how to shift power. Cameron, would you like to begin? I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, to make sure it's unmuted. So yeah, that community penetration is something that I spoke to in terms of it comes from talking to people and learning about either their high level engagement or really low level engagement in a particular thing. And I think that is it's baked into how certain public participation is taking place now. My experience is on these very community-centered efforts around this particular event that took place several years ago. So how to shift power from the agency kind of setting the timeline and like, this is when things take place, this is when you have the opportunity to comment. It's what, it's a thing I'm doing when I'm talking to people, whether they're calling or email, is what is their desired participation they want to have? What is their desired timeline? What is their desired input that they want to put in there? And what are the tools that they would need or want to be able to do that really effectively? So I think it's both sides. It's organizations like Beachwise and the work that we're doing to listen to how are people actually, engaged in this process on this groundwater contamination cleanup, and looking at the process that exists and really kind of deconstructing it. So it's like, okay, if we're really setting things up so everybody comes to this one feasibility study meeting, and the agencies are like, cool, we checked off our boxes, that's great. To me, that's not enough. What is the real equitable and just outcome of this work is that the community has the agency and then the power of the knowledge of how this process works. They know the buttons to push, that they get to set their times. This is actually how we want it to happen in our neighborhood for our community. You need to have this meeting at this place in this way. So I think it's really, from our standpoint, from a community advocate and community partner, it's telling those agencies who are setting the schedule and how things are supposed to work and saying like, no, that's not going to work. This is how this community wants to make it happen. So that's our standpoint. That's our lens as a partner for the community, is listening and then telling the folks who have created the structures, this is how it needs to be different, and really making sure those things are accountable. So we're not looking to just come in, be a fix. We're looking to address an issue, address a problem or conversation the community is having, and then leave behind a structure that the community has ownership of. This is how we do public participation here, in telling ecology or Boeing or whoever it is, this is how our process needs to work for our community. And I think that can then start to shift the conversation and how these public engagement can happen.
Great, thanks so much. Yeah, community ownership. It's that is and honoring community ownership and being a partner to community and implementing what comes out of these processes. Zach, anything to add in the last minute and a half before we wrap this up?
No, I think Cameron has taken us to a really great closing place, and I'll just say I think that principle of really asking communities what's right for you applies to it's like at the core of the answers to so many different questions. So there's this big tension about shared and open streets right now. We'd be doing them more in vulnerable communities. We'd be holding back and doing less for concerns of policing and enforcement and these kinds of things. And the answer is that it's always going to be complicated, and it starts with that conversation and listening to what communities really want to look for. So I think that's a perfect place to close.
Well, with that, I do want to pivot to our sort of contact slide and just thank all of the panelists for their time today, and all of the audience members for participating, for the questions that you thoughtfully included in the question and answer. We will be sending out the recording of this video, and we will also send out, I think, some of the links to the principles and any other resources that we might have mentioned. And with that, thank you. Stay tuned. We hope to have more resources in the future. And for those of you that are still, wanting to have further discussion about how to conduct engagement in this time and going forward using some of these principles, please reach out to myself, Naomi Dorner, or Yanisa Tachagumthorm, or anyone at Nelson and Nygaard, or any of the panelists. With that, thank you. Have a great afternoon. Goodbye, everyone.